morning and welcome to Teach Me Bees. I'm your host, Dave Westcott, and I have with me this morning special guest Randy Oliver. Randy is a well known beekeeper from California. He has been studying honeybee biology with a major focus on varroa mites. Randy calls his work scientific beekeeping. He is a leader in honeybee genetics and has practical beekeeping experience. He has a PhD
Nope.
and has a beekeeping business with his sons. Should we call you Dr. Oliver?
No, actually, I don't have a PhD. I went back to UC Davis, who I knew, researchers there, to apply to get a PhD there after I got my master's. And he said, "Oh, we'd love to have you, Randy. Unfortunately, there's no jobs waiting for anybody with a PhD in apiculture right now." And I had a family, so I went back home and built houses for 25 years and built my beekeeping business up. So I never did get a PhD.
Okay, well, close. And I'd also like to introduce Scott the beekeeper is on the call as well. So thank you all for joining us.
Hey, good morning.
Randy, can you give the audience a brief personal bio of where you live and what your family's like and what kind of beekeeping work you do?
Okay, I live up in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about 2,900 feet. So we do get a winter here. I grew up in Southern California, where you don't get much of a winter. I picked up I was always a naturalist as a child and scientist, and picked up a swarm of bees when I was about 14 years old and got them into a cardboard box. I had no idea what to do with them. And I asked around at the high school, and one of the other students had a father who was a sideline beekeeper with a couple hundred colonies. So I started beekeeping the traditional way by apprenticing to a knowledgeable beekeeper, and kept bees as a hobbyist for about 20 years. And then finally moved up here to Northern California and built up a small commercial operation large enough that I could quit my other jobs and make my living as a beekeeper. And then when varroa mite came, it killed virtually almost all my colonies. I had 250 hives at the time. I actually stopped beekeeping for a year. I was just so heartbroken seeing all my hives dead. And then these Apistan strips came out, and beekeepers said, "Hey, there's these plastic strips. You put them in there and you keep bees again." So I did that. We scraped out all the wax moth out of 250 hives and restarted the business again. And did well for several years until the mites developed resistance to the first synthetic miticide. And then they developed resistance to the second synthetic miticide. And I said, okay, I got degrees in entomology and animal culture. Why am I letting a mite kick my butt? So I started self-educating again.
Okay.
And made the mistake of writing an article for the American Bee Journal, and they said, "Can you write some more?" And I went down a slippery slope of, with no intention whatsoever, of lots of people wanting to ask me questions, and I like to answer questions, so that's what I do.
Wow.
Wow. That's pretty cool. So I hate varroa mites myself. They actually cause me major anxiety. That's my number one fear is just the varroa mite. And
so understand this: the varroa mite is an absolutely fascinating organism, and I spent a year developing my varroa mite model that for beekeepers use. By the time the end of that year was up, I knew varroa mite better than I knew my own wife. Really to understand the organism, and if you talk to Sammy Ramsey too, Professor Sammy Ramsey. Varroa mite is an absolutely fascinating organism. Now, it's a total pain in the butt for beekeepers, but as a form of life, it's very interesting.
Wow.
What is it? What is it to you that makes it so interesting? How do you move from fear and stress and pain to, wow, they're pretty incredible?
It's one of the most perfectly adapted parasites there is. It can do something that very few other parasites can do. It can actually take very complex proteins directly from the honeybee, from the separate proteins from the pupae and from the adult bee, And instead of digesting them, take them straight into their eggs, which saves them a tremendous amount of metabolic processing. It actually has lost a number of genes and depends totally upon the honeybees to produce some of the proteins that the varroa mite needs. And here's this monster mite relative to your body. It's about the size of a Dungeness crab. So something you would notice, it can get on a bee, and within a couple of hours, it smells exactly like the bee. The bee cannot recognize it as being separate from itself. And it can almost impossible to be groomed off by the bee. It's learned to read the bee pheromones in order to get on the right age bee and then transfer to the right age larva at the right time. So a really incredible parasite.
Wow.
That is crazy. So how are you fighting it?
What I'm trying to do is hand the job over to my bees to do the job for me. Something that we should have done many, many years ago in this country. In those few countries where the beekeepers didn't skip the integrated pest management pyramid and went straight to the synthetic mite. I should say this. In most countries, beekeepers skipped the integrated pest management pyramid, went right past resistant stock, past the mechanical methods, biotechnical methods, past the organic treatments, and went right up to the synthetic miticides. In those few countries where beekeepers didn't do that, it takes about 6 years, and your bees are resistant from natural selection to varroa mite, and you don't even talk about varroa mite. So South Africa, if you go to the South African beekeeping journals, they don't even mention varroa mite. Okay, Cuba does not, bother with varroa mite. So we just dropped the ball by not. If you're going to start using synthetic miticides, that behooves you to simultaneously engage in a strong selective breeding program because you're taking it away from nature. If you're using synthetic miticides, you're stopping the natural evolution, host parasite evolution, which means that it's your responsibility to pick up on that. And selective breeding is simply directed evolution. And that's what we have been engaged in now for the last 7 years and finally showing some pretty good signs of success. The other thing is, after the first 2 synthetic miticides, after the mites developed resistance to them, I said, well, that's enough of that being on that treadmill. And I stepped off of it in 2001 and stopped using any synthetic miticides. So we've run a commercial operation successfully for over 20 years without using any synthetic miticides in our operation, using only the natural or quote organic treatments.
Wow. That's really cool. Randy, can you kind of define for us what is scientific beekeeping? I think your website's scientificbeekeeping.com.
Yep.
What exactly do you mean by this?
I should have brought in the book I just finished reading from 1890, Scientific Queen Rearing by Doolittle. And it has nothing to do with test tubes or fancy equipment. Scientific means that instead of your practices being based upon what somebody tells you or what's common sense or traditional, you actually base your practices on understanding the biology of the honeybee and of the varroa mite and the physics and the chemistry involved in that. So it's more about questioning your common sense. And this is something that's a red flag for us. Anytime that I say to one of my assistants, well, it makes common sense, or it's perfect sense that this will work, they'll say, okay, there you go. There's the red flag, because what we find is what you can convince yourself makes perfect sense. It's wrong about half the time. And so when you actually then test it scientifically to collect hard data, you find out, wow, it's often totally contrary to what you expect.
Wow, that's pretty cool. You know what? This is most of the calls we do, to be perfectly honest, they when you leave the call, this is no joke, and we've had many people on this call. When we leave this call, you feel like very stressed out about being in the bee business. you feel like, did you make a mistake in being in the bee business because everything's going to be, destroyed by varroa mites? And I love that your approach is different, and you're saying that there is a solution to varroa mites, and in different parts of the world, varroa mites aren't a big deal. It's a shrug of the shoulders, and I think that's really that's really refreshing just for me. Um, as a beekeeper, it's a very refreshing thought, and it's
Hmm.
also a new way of thinking, because most of the time, to be perfectly honest, I leave the call in a mode of panic, and I think, oh gosh, God, what are we going to do? We're going to have to treat these things constantly. We're going to be doing this. We're going to be losing hives, and you're really saying that if we take this organic approach and we allot the time, roughly 6 years, that we're going to be able to have beehives without the without the ruin of varroa. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, first let's look at the basic axioms of commercial beekeeping. There's two requisites. First, you got to be dumb enough to try it, and second, you got to be tough enough to stick with it. Okay?
There
If you
you
want to make
go.
money,
Yeah.
there's a million ways to make money much easier than commercial beekeeping. You don't become a commercial beekeeper for the money because you like the challenge and you like the lifestyle. When you have a big problem in any kind of business or industry, that means that there are opportunities for those who can solve that problem. So we take 1,000 hives to almonds every year, and we get graded at top strength, get premium, and we've done that for the last 30, almost 40 years. Okay, um, despite not using any synthetic miticides, um, we sell 1,000 nucleus hives out of those every single year. Okay, which means that that's the way you tell if you're being successful. So, and as far as the amount of effort involved or extra work, it isn't. We don't spend any more money on mite control than beekeepers who's using the synthetic pesticides. So what I've been trying to do is with the commercial beekeepers, bringing up that we know that the mites will develop resistance to every synthetic miticide because they have such a narrow mode of action. It's easy to develop resistance. We're all surprised that Amitraz has worked as long as it has. But for years, I'm saying Amitraz is not going to work forever. Start learning alternative methods now, so when it fails, you'll be ready. And what I'm seeing now, the last 3 years or so, quite a few large commercial beekeepers who have been corresponding with me quite a lot have dropped Amitraz out of their operation and are moving on to the natural treatments. Now, you can call them organic treatments. They're not certified organic. They can be, but the natural treatments may be better term for them. So we're seeing this sea change. As I travel around the world speaking to other beekeepers groups, in the last few months, I've spoken in England, Chile, Slovenia, just got back from Azerbaijan. I'm speaking not in person next week to Iran. In all these countries, Amitraz is failing. All the commercial industry across the world has depended upon Amitraz, and across the world, it's failing. In Mediterranean Europe, Amitraz just is not working anymore. So they're all shifting by necessity to using the natural treatments and trying to learn how to do this. So what I've just been doing is walking the walk for the last 20 years, figuring out how to actually use them efficaciously and without much expense and or time to manage the mite.
Wow, that is amazing. So how does one get on this program? How does one switch programs? How do you do that?
Well, as far as the breeding program, that's not for everybody. You need to have at least 1,000 hives and someplace where you can produce a lot of queens. When I'm doing that as a demonstration project for the commercial queen producers, because what they were saying is, oh, it's just going to be too hard. It takes too much effort. You got to do too much science to do a commercial breeding program for a selective breeding program for varroa mites. And they didn't know how long it would take and whether they could start with their own stock, or they had to bring in outside stock, and they're very proud of their own stock. So I said, let me just do a demonstration project. Let's start with my own stock, not bring in any outside stock at all, and do the simplest possible method of doing it. And I'll keep track of how many hours it takes and what my success is. And I'll just report every year the good, the bad, and the ugly to them. So that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. We started off out of 1,500 hives. We initially identified one colony that was able to maintain its mites to 0 counts all by itself, which meant that the genes for doing that were already existing in my operation. Okay, unless you're doing mite washes on 1,500 hives, I never would have found that hive. I would have just treated it like all the rest. So most beekeepers, or all beekeepers, probably have, if you're large scale, have some already resistant hives in your operation, but you just don't know it because you're not doing enough mite washes to see. So out of that 1 out of 1,500, over 7 years now, we've worked up to almost 50% of our hives not needing treatment. So that's a 500-fold increase in the prevalence of resistant bees. We don't claim resistant stock yet. When we get to 95% and consistent heritability, if we sell a queen that her daughters will all be resistant, we're not there yet. But we are making very, very clear progress. And the exciting thing for us is 2 big things this year. This coming year, for the first time, over 50% of our drone pool will be coming from resistant hives. Up till now, when you mate a queen, they're mating with the drone pool mainly of non-resistant hives, because the genetics of the drone pool lags 2 years behind the genetics of the current population. I won't go into the details of that, but it reflects there's a 2-year lag in the genetic diversity of the drone pool. The second thing is we were approached by a friend, a very large commercial producer, this year to propagate our queens. And I said, well, no, we can't do that because we can't control the drone pool. And he goes, well, I've got rights to a 25,000 acre ranch, and we can completely control all the hives on that and control your drone pool. And I said, wow. So that is something that we are going to be doing this spring for the first time, to actually start to control our matings. So we have our fingers crossed that will allow us to make that final hurdle and get up to that 95% resistant stock in the next couple of years.
Wow.
This question I have for you: if someone buys your hives, if they buy your nukes, are the nukes that you're selling, are they already going to be resistant to varroa mite, or do they have to gain that on their own?
No, about 50% of them at this time turn out to be resistant. I get lots of feedback from people, and that percentage has grown every year. You know, like I said, from a fraction of percent that we're now pushing 50%. We actually had a couple of yards last year that almost 70% of the hives exhibited strong resistance. Now, resistance is not a black or white. There's degrees of resistance. So those colonies that are 100% resistant, that the mites just cannot grow in, those are our breeders. There's a whole lot of hives in our operation that this fall, my son said, well, you know, they don't really need a treatment, but Dad, would you mind if we just gave them, you know, one treatment going into the winter just so they start clean? I go, yeah, no, go ahead. You know, we already determined that they are not fully resistant, but largely resistant. So if we can get down to 1 or 2 treatments a year with a natural product, that would be a huge change over the kinds of what we call mite candy that most beekeepers keep right now. If you're only breeding for large productive colonies, not breeding for mite resistance, you're breeding for mite candy, because the food of varroa mites is brood. So these big colonies with lots of brood are just pure varroa food. And if they don't exhibit resistance, then they just have an unlimited amount of food for the varroa mite.
So Randy, I'm curious if you could tell us. Well, I have 2 thoughts, and however we want to go here. One, what should most people do now? If you recommended, maybe break it down into the backyard or small operation.
Wait a minute. I don't do any shoulds, and I don't do any recommendations.
Okay.
I put out information. It's free to everybody if they want to use it or not.
Okay.
But I don't recommend anything, and there's no shoulds in beekeeping.
Where can they
It all
find
depends
that?
upon what your goals are.
Where can they find that information?
On my website, scientificbeekeeping.com. It's poorly organized. I'm going to try to organize it better. But it's a history of what I've learned since 2006 when I started writing. You can do a deep dive into it. There's a search function on that, so you can look up things. Start with the more recent articles. Our articles are listed by publication date, and you can follow what I've learned.
Okay. No recommendations, but informed information you can look to make some decisions. Can you tell us a little bit about your operation with your sons? What's that like? I think you kind of mentioned you've like passed it off and they kind of run the operation. Just tell us a little bit about that and what that has been like.
Well, I grew the operation, and they grew up with it. They grew up riding in a child's seat in the truck, delivering hives up to Nevada, delivering hives to the almonds. Interesting thing is, I was riding a few years ago with my younger son. I said, Ian, we had just dropped bees off in the almonds. I said, do you realize that you have been riding in this truck for over, he was 20 some years old. So I said,
Wow.
25 years to this same orchard, to this same drop of hives with the same truck, everything the same. Back then, I used to do it for $700 a load. He goes, well, what are we making now? And I said, we just unloaded them. I said, well, we made $11,000 for this load. So just in his lifetime, going to the same spot, doing the same pollination, it went from $700 income to $11,000 income. Now, you tell me, is beekeeping more profitable now than it was then?
Well, I guess that would depend on the cost of inflation, but it sounds like it's a lot more profitable.
It's way ahead of inflation, I'll tell you right there. I've already calculated it out. Yeah, beekeeping is more profitable now than it has been in my entire career.
Wow.
So all the complainers are complaining because they're just not learning how to manage their colonies.
When you sell your hives, do you have a long wait list for selling your hives?
We generally do have a wait list for nukes, yes.
Because everybody wants these hives.
Yeah, and we're not trying to say that our hives are special or anything like that. We do a very high quality nuke. That's why we have a wait list. We don't put any. Unfortunately, there are beekeepers that sell off their junk frames as nukes. I've seen nukes being sold that had 4 different brands on the top bars, which means the people are just scavenging all the junk out of their operation and passing it off onto an unsuspecting hobbyist. That's unfortunate. So we don't do that. And I'm not trying to badmouth anybody, but buyer beware. If you're a beekeeper and buying nukes, you want to do a close inspection that you're not bringing in frames that are loaded up with pesticides, loaded up with foul brood or something like that. Buy from a reputable seller on the nukes. And I can't remember what your question was.
My question was just on the wait list. And you got that one. So for a new beekeeper out there, what is your recommendation for a new person getting into bees? What's the number one thing they should be looking at?
You still use the word sugar and recommendation in the same sentence.
Okay,
the two words I told you not to use. Okay, that's okay. So here's the deal. First thing, look at your motivation. If your motivation is to save the bees, plant flowers. Don't get a beehive. We're already stocked beyond carrying capacity in many areas. Okay. Now, if your motivation is to have an enjoyable hobby, that you're interested in getting more in tune with nature by having bees, if you're fascinated by biology of bees, then by all means, get some hives. You don't need more than 2 hives to do that. The one of the problems, I call it the marriage problem, is every spring, if you're successful, your hives want to swarm, so you split them. That's called exponential growth. You double your number of hives every year if you're successful. And eventually the spouse says, I thought this was going to be a hobby. We got 45 hives in the backyard and you're talking about splitting them again. So what I would suggest is don't get on that treadmill. you can split your hives to avoid swarming in the springtime, and then recombine them at the beginning of the honey flow and have a super hives that make a lot of honey. So 2 hives is all that the recreational beekeeper needs. In many areas, again, we're beyond carrying capacity, and I see this worldwide right now. There's more beehives in the world right now than there have ever been in history. And in many areas, your honey crops are going down because there's just too many hives competing for the same amount of flowers. You don't want to overstock. That's called the tragedy of the commons, is overstocking the carrying capacity. So my suggestion is, or my plea to beekeepers is, yeah, if you want to get a couple of hives, get a couple of hives, but there's no need to expand them, because check your carrying capacity of your landscape. Many cities right now are beyond carrying capacity for honeybees.
Wow.
That's shocking to know, but it's also good to know. So as we bring this in for a landing here, as you know, this has been super beneficial. This is one of the best calls I think I've ever been on, and I really appreciate your knowledge and wisdom and taking the time to share with us.
Let me add one more thing. As far as suggestions, is varroa control is number one. Virtually all hobby hives die after the first year or two from inadequate varroa management. We have lots of people coming back, and you can come back for a couple of years to buy a fresh nuke or get a fresh package. But after that, we refer to them as serial killers, because they're getting these animals that we love. We love our queens that we've hand reared, and then they don't manage varroa, and the colonies die an ugly death. And that is irresponsible as far as animal husbandry. We love our bees. We want to treat them well. So parasite control is a major thing that any responsible person does with animal husbandry. So number one thing is control varroa.
It looks like we may have lost the end of this call, everybody. Thank you for joining us here for Teach Me Bees with Randy Oliver, Dave Westcott, myself, Scott Callentine. Check out scientificbeekeeping.com to follow Randy in his scientific beekeeping adventure and to learn more. Again, not recommendations, but just helpful information for you to make informed decisions. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes to come.